Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That? A psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with Dr. Daniel Wann to discuss the psychology of sports fandom. Dan is a professor of psychology at Murray State University, where he has taught since 1991. He earned his PhD in social psychology from the University of Kansas. Dan's research is centered on the psychology of sport fandom, particularly the phenomenon of team identification, how deeply fans feel connected to their sports teams. He explores its causes, consequences, and various associated behaviors, including fan aggression, well-being, coping strategies, superstitions, and behavioral loyalty, like game attendance. Over decades of scholarship, Dan has produced an impressive volume of research, well over 200 publications. His work not only advances academic understanding of sport fandom, but also garners media attention. He has been featured and consulted by outlets including ESPN, the New York Times, the Huffington Post, and HBO's Real Sports. He recently co-authored the third edition of Sports Fans, The Psychology and Social Impact of Fandom. One key takeaway from my conversation with Dan was the remarkable breadth of sports fandom's influence on an individual's life. While non-fans might dismiss team identification as trivial, silly, or merely living vicariously through strangers, the reality is that fandom offers tangible benefits. It can provide thrilling entertainment, give people something to anticipate and rally around, and foster a sense of belonging within a close-knit community. Like any pastime, it can be taken to excess, but for many, the personal and social rewards more than justify the investment of time and energy. Another insight from our discussion was how sports fandom offers a front-row seat to some of the most common biases in human thinking. Fans often display in-group favoritism, filtering their judgments to protect their team-related identity, crediting victories to skill while dismissing losses as flukes. While these biases also appear in higher stakes arenas, such as politics and social debates, sports often provides a lower stakes, more playful environment in which to observe them. This context invites us to acknowledge, perhaps with a bit of humility, that none of us are entirely objective thinkers. If you're a devoted sports fan, you'll likely find this deep dive into the psychology of fandom both engaging and illuminating. And you may even recognize ways your passion shapes how you think about your team. And if sports aren't your thing, I hope this conversation sparks a new appreciation for the meaning and value that team identification can bring. Enjoy. Okay, today I am joined by Daniel Wann. Thank you so much for being on today.
My pleasure.
Daniel has been researching the area of sports fandom since the mid-'80s. I'm really excited to chat with you about sports fandom. I'm a big sports fan myself, mostly NFL football. We'll try to mix it up in our conversation. But before we get into the specifics of fandom and the psychology of the sports fan, in your view, there are lots of different group affiliations that human beings have. They have strong feelings about their race, their ethnicity, their religious affiliation, political party. All of these things feed into the human identity. Do you think that there's anything unique about sports team affiliation?
I think that there are several things that are unique about it. I do think that there are more commonalities among different groups than there are differences. But there are some things that set fandom apart. I think that, we discuss at length anymore about how sport fandom, like other social entities, has the ability to assist people in meeting some basic human needs. So, for example, sport fandom can help individuals meet the need to belong. Sport fandom is very much a social activity. People go to sporting events as parts of groups with their friends or their family. It's not done in isolation very often. Sure, people listen to the radio in their car or something, but by and large, people are watching games, consuming sport in groups. Well, it lets you know what you're a part of when you do that, but also it meets the need for distinctiveness because it lets you know what you're not a part of, right? You can't, when you ask sports fans, tell me about your life as a fan, sure, they'll tell you who they love, but immediately after that, they'll tell you who they hate, right? So part of being a fan is who we are and who we're not. I'm not saying that sport's the only way you can gain those needs. Of course, there are other ways, but sport is in some ways uniquely situated because it is such a social activity. Sports fans wear their affiliation on their sleeves, right? I mean, you know who they root for, who they're a part of. And I would also say that one of the things that is unique for fandom is that the outcome is in doubt, right? It's not a scripted outcome. So, you could think about individuals that are fans of Star Wars, and there are people out there that they are so into Star Wars, that set of movies, that they make the diehard sports fans look amateurish, right? Sports fans, you dress up for your games. These people dress up for work. But it doesn't matter how many times you see Star Wars. Darth Vader always says, "I'm your father, Luke." I mean, it's always the same thing, but you really don't know what you're going to get with an entity in sport, right? Because you know that when you consume sport, there's like a 50-50-ish chance that when you're done consuming this product, you're going to be cranky, you're going to be upset, you're going to be depressed. I think that that's one way that this group affiliation, this association, is different because really the outcome remains in doubt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're going to talk about the benefits of team identification as we continue to chat. Before we get to that, obviously there are a host of different causes that drive sports fandom. Could you just give us an overview of what are the reasons behind the driving forces behind sports fandom?
I think that I always have to start this discussion by saying that you'd be shocked at the lack of consistency in when people say why they follow the teams that they follow. We did a study several years ago where we asked about 100 individuals, tell us the reasons why you started following your favorite team. We got over 300 different answers. One
Wow.
person listed 16 different reasons. And when you have that much of a diverse, uh, set of antecedents for any activity, you're not going to give it as much overlap as you might think. Yes, some things are fairly standard. So geography likely plays a role, that people are likely to follow a team if it's a local team. Certainly being socialized is a critical factor, that we find that most fans, when they're asked, so how did you become a fan of this team? Give us the list of reasons. Being someone who grew up in a household where mom and dad follow those teams, or maybe older siblings follow that team, that's a pretty powerful player. But even then, it's only like about 20 or 25% of the people that you ask. So the things that you kind of think of are there, but you also have to note that there are so many other, like, more peripheral reasons. People will say, well, I like the stadium, I like the mascot, I like the colors of the uniforms. So you get such a wide variety of perspectives. There are, however, psychological reasons, right? I mean, some people will seek out a team because they're wanting to fit in, they're wanting to belong in some way. So when someone moves to a new locale, and like, I really kind of want to fit in and get to know the people. What's the thing that goes on in this town? They find out that there's a pretty popular sporting event. Well, if they go to follow that event or that team, that's going to allow them to gain these connections. So we actually find that there are psychological variables in addition to these more environmental causes, like, do your parents follow the team, and do you live near there? Do you work for that university, perhaps?
Mm-hmm.
But again, the bottom line is, if you get 100 people in a room and you ask them, you're going to get more than 100 different responses, because being a sport fan and the like the journey that people take as a sport fan, it's very idiosyncratic. I mean,
Mhm.
two stories are never ever the same.
So, how about the level of dedication? I assume that even though there are lots of factors that attract people to sports, I would imagine that there's a more narrow set of ideas that will predict who the dedicated sports fans are. And part of why I'm asking this is because I've grown up in South Florida and I live in Central Florida now. And when I travel to a city that is known for their sports team, Pittsburgh, for example, there are lots of cities that when you see the fandom there, it feels different. It feels very different. I don't know what causes that. I'm curious as to your thoughts. If we know these predictors of dedication, does it have to do with how much else is going on in the city? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, if we knew the exact predictors, if I knew what they were, I wouldn't be telling you. I'd be contacting the NFL and making a lot of money.
Right, right.
It would be so nice if we had like this recipe for what turns someone into a fan. So there's not really a personality profile right now, and people have looked for it because there'd be a lot of money in finding this profile.
Hmm.
But what I can say in response to your point is that fans for the Pittsburgh Steelers and fans for the Los Angeles Dodgers and fans for the Chicago Cubs, they are going to differ. And they're going to differ because certain types of teams have an image, a brand, and certain types of people will be like just attracted toward those types of brands. So if you're someone who likes, on edge, technology, new wave thinking. Some of the old school sports teams probably aren't for you. If you're someone who I want to be on top, I want to always see my team, well, you probably would like the Cowboys because they
Right.
used to be considered America's team, right? If you're,
Mhm.
hardworking, blue collar, the Pittsburgh Steelers are the team for you. So we do know that the fans can represent the team and the team can represent the fans. And so certain types of individuals, they're going to be attracted to specific teams because they the characteristics of those teams resonate with those fans for whatever reason.
I see. In your research, uh, do you see that you can categorize most fans on sort of a continuous spectrum where it's just low, medium, and high dedication? Or do you see a little bit more nuance where there might be sort of categories of sports fan? I'm thinking like, the bandwagon fan and they fit this certain, pathway.
Yeah, it really depends on which sort of typology scale you want to go with, right?
Okay.
So there are certain individuals, a good friend of mine and colleague, Jeff James, he has this psychological continuum model that he talks about all the time, where they have these various stages from basically, your awareness of the team all the way up to your allegiance to the team, where you're basically, bleeding the team's colors. I tend to look at it more from a psychological perspective, and I talk about the connections, the identification that the fan feels with the team. So you can have a scale that runs from no connection, no identification, the team has no relevance to me whatsoever, all the way up to a very highly identified fan, where for this individual, the team is a central component to their identity. They can't even imagine like describing themselves in ways that would not in somehow, some form reflect their allegiance for this team. Years ago, we asked people to imagine that you're going to work with a research partner on some task, and here's 20 lines, write down things about you that you would want this person to know. And we had also assessed a level of identification with the University of Kentucky men's basketball team. What we found was that those that were at the highest level of identification was clearly a central component of their identification with themselves, or their self-identity, that these people, line 2, 3, 4, right away, they would write, I'm a diehard Kentucky basketball fan.
Mhm.
And it used to always make me laugh when I was coding that data because it would be like, I'm a Kentucky basketball fan. And the one right below it would be, I'm a Baptist. So they were really getting their hierarchies in line. They're
Right.
letting you know their allegiances. The work that I've done over the last 4 decades has by and large looked at these highly identified sports fans, the ones that, they really care about the team. These are the ones that are, they're buying the tickets when the team is terrible. It doesn't matter. They're the ones that are going to be so biased in their reactions to the team. I'm not saying other sports fans in terms of dedication aren't important. They are. From a marketing perspective, certainly they're interested in the low and moderate identified fans because those ones you can move the needle on, right?
Right.
The highly identified fans, they don't really care how bad the product is. They're going to keep buying season tickets. The question for the marketing people is how do they get from low to moderate and moderate to high? Those moderates, that's where you find those bandwagon fans, right? One year
Mhm.
they're there, the next year they're not, as a function of the team's performance. So all of those different categories matter. But again, from the psychological perspective, I'm trying to figure out why these individuals do the things that they do.
Mhm.
And what you find is the more you care about something, the more intense your affective behavior and cognitive reactions. So we're talking about the highly identified fans at that point.
Okay, so let's jump right into some of the consequences of being a big fan of a team. You mentioned earlier social connection. Um, is it the case that the lion's share of the benefits comes from the the shared experience with other fans? I think of my own fandom and how I was, a Steelers fan living in South Florida, and I felt, I felt similar benefits to other fans. I think in the sense of I have this, source of joy. I can root for them. Um, However, I didn't live in Pittsburgh, and there does seem to be something special that happens when you're immersed in the community. Is it the case that the social piece explains, like, 80% of the benefits, or is it just one of many different benefits?
I think that it's one of many different benefits, but it's got to be at the top of the list. And I say that for a few reasons. First of all, again, sport is very much a social activity. And we know that anytime you're talking about a social activity, then the need to belong, the need for these connections, it's going to be at the forefront, right? So I think also that this relates to some research that we just recently conducted. I don't even know that we had all of the data completely analyzed
Hmm.
yet, but
Hmm.
we asked sports fans, here are some needs that can be met through your fandom, like the need to belong, the need for distinctness, also the need for structure, because sports fans set their days and weeks based on their fandom for the team, and then also meaning in life, right? For a lot of fans, it's like, yeah, it's one of the reasons that I like to get up in the morning. It gives me this connection to something larger than the self. We asked them, in terms of being a fan in general, and also in terms of following a team, which one of these needs is best, most effectively met through your sport fandom? And it was belongingness, right? It was the connections that they were gaining. They were very clear that there was a gap between that need and all of the ones below it.
Hmm.
So I think that to some degree, if you want to know, okay, so how well are these needs being met? Maybe you should ask the people that are actually having the needs met. So I think that information is informative, right? So they're telling us, yes, I find that these connections that I gain, that's the need most readily accessible to be met through sport fandom. Having
Hmm.
said all of that, I do think that the benefits of fandom are somewhat a function of whether or not the fan is local or non-local, right? So if you are living in Central Florida as a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers, well, then it's going to be a little bit difficult to meet the need to belong. Less so in 2025 than 20 years ago with the social media and the internet. You can watch it with other fans,
Hmm.
watch it with quotes around it.
Right.
But certainly what it does easily meet is the need for distinctiveness, right? So if you're in South Florida and you're wearing, Pittsburgh gear, well, that lets you stand out. It lets you be unique. So maybe that's a need that in that environment is more readily met through your sport fandom. So I think it's a function of where that person's life has placed them in terms of what needs will be and benefits will be best met through the fandom.
Yeah, I was that was really interesting what you said about structure too. I never really gave that any thought that when you have this big part of your identity and you're planning your week, it's like, okay, well there's a game I want to watch on Thursday, and well there's another team playing in the division on Sunday, and you know it might be oversimplifying it, but it seems as though just being a big sports fan can really, really give you some order in your life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sport fandom allows people to structure their day, their week, their month, their seasons, their
They're
years.
traveling. Yeah,
They're
yeah.
traveling. Exactly. There are people that have travel plans years in advance for the Olympics. There are people that will be, okay, when is the Super Bowl, right? That day is set aside for our family gathering to have a Super Bowl party. There are people that always set aside, okay, when is the NFL draft and when's the opening day of Major League Baseball? And that's not even team specific. That's just sports specific. But if you're we're season ticket holders for Murray State Racer basketball, and the second the schedule comes out, I can tell you what I'm doing at 7:05 on like 20 different nights over the course of November through March, right? And when the Missouri Valley Conference tournament is announced, I can tell you I will be in St. Louis for this Wednesday through this Sunday and this some week in March. Humans crave structure. We like routine. I'm not saying that we want every day to be the same, right? So we want some variety too. But there's comfort in knowing what's going to happen next. There's comfort in having plans established. Again, we don't want it to be routine too much. So that's another advantage of sport, right? So sport allows for structure. I know exactly when I'm going to go to these games. When I get to those games, I really have no idea what's going to happen. So there's some excitement, some mystery, some curiosity that goes on. But if it's football and I'm a football fan, all right, Central Time Zone, 12 o'clock, 3:30 on Sunday, Sunday night game, Monday night game. If I'm lucky, two Monday night games, right? I got some 4:30 and 7:30. So it allows people to set up their weekly, monthly, and seasonal calendar and gives them something to look forward to.
We're obviously giving some examples of what can change about a person as they become a bigger fan of a team. I want to stay on this in terms of the social identity piece. What do we know about what changes about a fan as their team affiliation gets more and more intertwined with their core identity?
Yeah, so we know that the more you care, the more the team is a central component of the individual's identity. That's going to impact the way they act, the way they think, and the way they feel. And I don't just mean specifically to when they're watching a game, right? It's not that a fan, as they become, more allegiant to a team, that only manifests itself, after the tip off and before the last horn goes off. That's not true. It impacts their lives above and beyond, right? So the more that they get invested in the team, the more it's going to impact their affect, behavior, and cognition, both within the consumption time period and outside of it. So one of the consequences that we have found consistently over the years is that the more someone identifies with a sport team, if it's a local team, the more connections that they can rarely gain from that team. So we'll go back to the Pittsburgh Steelers. If you are a Steelers fan and you're walking through a mall in Pittsburgh in, oh, we'll go with early October, and you've got on a Steelers jacket and a Steelers hat, there are people that are going to say hi to you. You're going to get high fives, go Steelers. You don't know their name, you don't know where they live, you don't know what their job they have, but you're going to feel like you've got these momentary connections to a larger society around you. Those connections are critically valuable for psychological well-being.
Mm-hmm. And
The
it's
research,
everywhere, right? It
it's
like as
everywhere.
you
That's
say,
exactly right.
you can take a large city that would just ordinarily, if there was no sports team there, you would feel isolated, and then immediately feel immersed in part of a tribal identity.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be intricate, detailed disclosure type of interactions.
Right.
They can be very quick, it's just going to make you feel like you fit in. And those connections that people feel, that's what ultimately can lead to the well-being benefits from the fandom. We've known for 100 years in psychology that social connections are critical for well-being, right? It's not like all of a sudden the sport fan literature, stumbled upon something that no one ever thought about before. No, we've known for, decades and decades and decades that if people have social networks, social support, that can buffer, anxiety and depression and loneliness and things of that nature. Well, given that 2/3 of our society is a big time sports fan and that it's a social activity, then you would expect it to have these same potential benefits, and it does, right? So if you are identifying with a local team and you find all of these other connections that come through those identifications, then you're going to feel lower levels of loneliness, less alienated. You're going to feel as though social bonds are there, social cohesion is there. You're going to feel more satisfied with your group memberships, and your social life satisfaction will be higher. All of these things are consequences of being a more deeply involved sport fan. Now, not just sport fandom, right? And these same benefits are going to come from religious institutions, work institutions, family gatherings. But again, we have an awful lot of people who are sports fans. So you're talking about an awful lot of people that have the potential to gain these benefits.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second because I can do this because I consider myself a big sports fan. But you could make a case that somebody can be too big of a sports fan, just too dedicated, and because at some point time is a limited resource. Perhaps you're spending too much time, you're neglecting your work life or your social life, or your key relationships in favor of sports, and obviously that wouldn't be an ideal scenario. But even deeper, I sympathize with the argument that some people don't like sports fans, and they'll say, how do you spend so much time dedicated to a group of people that you have no control over? You aren't a player, you're rooting for them. How do you spend so much time doing that? And we listed all these benefits, but do you think that being a hardcore sports fan orients a person towards basking in this reflected glory, that what's going on over there, all my identity, my self-esteem is tied to them, how good they are playing, and it leaves like a vacuum inside of yourself where I don't accomplish my goals because my whole identity is tied to my sports team. What do you say to that?
I say first off that with every pastime, there are people who take it too far. There's no doubt that there are fans out there. They're few and they're far between, but there are fans out there that, for whatever reason, they've gotten so wrapped up in it that it is having a negative impact on their relationships. Shows about 2%, what the research showed, about 2% of a strong negative impact. There are people that consume sport so much that it impacts how well they do at work. You have to acknowledge those things, right? you would lose all credibility as a social scientist if you did not admit that there are people out there that take it too much. They're very much in the minority, but if you're saying that 2%, only 2% of sports fans, the sport fandom impacts their relationship, that's a small number. Okay, yeah. But 2% of 200 million people, that's a lot of people, right? So that's something that absolutely needs to be acknowledged. A different point is, yes, sport fandom. You're watching people do something. You're not actively participating in it, and you say that you have these people out there that they just don't get it. The non-fans, they just don't get it. Why would you care? You're not doing it. When I teach my psychology of sport fandom class, typically about 25, 35% of the students in that class have absolutely no interest in sport whatsoever as a fan. They take the class because they're trying to figure out what is up with all of these people. How do they care so much about these things? And we'll get into very interesting discussions. And this is one of the things that will often come up. They'll say, I don't know how you can care so much. You're not doing anything. You're just watching. My response has always been the same. What's your favorite thing? Some of them will say, I love the Harry Potter books. I will say, you didn't write them. You didn't act in the movies. You didn't direct the movies. They'll get this look on their face of, man, that's a really good point. Or somebody will say, I'm a music lover. All right, you didn't write it. You didn't play it. So I get it. A common criticism of sport is that it's done passively for fans, but yet we don't yell at museum goers for, well, you didn't paint that picture. You should be at home painting instead of. It's an argument that is discussed quite a bit in the social literature, particularly in sociology, as a criticism of fandom. What I would say in general to that is it's okay to observe sport. As long as it's okay to observe art, it's okay to listen to music. It should be okay just to observe this. But at the same time, you can do that too much. You can observe too much. You can gamble too much. You can spend too much money on tickets. And, we need to be cognizant that that's a fact.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to agree. So how does the benefit story differ based on whether the team that you identify with is a consistent winner or a consistent loser? I had especially interest a friend of mine, being a long Miami Dolphins fan, and lots of disappointment. Do we know if these types of fans have a different benefit? Is the benefit less if the team is a consistently losing team?
Yeah, you mentioning your friend who's a fan of the Dolphins, as a long-suffering Cubs fan and a fan of the Royals, I really don't care that much to hear about the sorrows of the Miami Dolphin fan.
Right.
Again, that's a little pedestrian on your sorrow. You need to work better on your sorrow. It's interesting that when we talk about the benefits of fandom and how it relates to team success, it's almost as if the success is the icing on the cake. Because you can get the benefits of sport fandom through those connections, regardless of how well the team does. If you watch video from the 1970 Chicago Cubs games on WGN, those teams were atrocious. Trust me, I know. Those teams were atrocious. And yet the bleachers were always packed. Those people do not look like they're having a bad time. Their team might be 40-80, but they look like they're having the best time ever because they're gaining those connections. Now, once the Cubs got good, I mean, let's be honest, they only had that one bad century. That's all. Once the Cubs got good, now it's like, oh, I got these connections and I can feel good about my team success-wise. It's a dangerous avenue, though, because for fans of teams that are long suffering, I mean long suffering, the Cleveland Browns come to mind.
Yeah.
Part of being a fan for those individuals is the fact that they are suffering, right? It becomes like a badge for them. Like they wear it like a bruise that they're so glad that they picked up playing tennis or something. And a large chunk of Cubs fans were saying that, yes, they desperately want the Cubs to win the World Series, but that they also recognized that once they did, something about being a Cub fan would no longer be there. The Red Sox fans were the same before they finally won the World Series a couple of decades ago. Like, yeah, I desperately want to see them win. Right? I'm not saying I don't want to see them win. I'm not going that far off the deep end, but I am going to acknowledge that if this team does actually win a World Series, then part of my identity as a
Yeah.
long-suffering fan, you know, I'm not suffering anymore, right? I mean, now it's like,
Mhm.
okay, we won. Now what do I do? And true confession here, I lived for the Cubs for about 40 something years. And then they won the World Series. And I am not near as a diehard fan of the Cubs as I used to be because, okay, so they won the World Series. Now what? So again, no fan's going to say, I want to keep losing, but they
Sure.
do acknowledge that, part of me
Yeah.
will go away.
Yeah, it's it reminds me of the work looking at depressed individuals and how they tend to seek information that confirms their views of themselves often. So you take a depressed individual and you tell them they're great. Um, a lot of times they have a hard time. It makes them uncomfortable. It's like, well, no, 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 I'm worthless. Like you can't tell me that I'm great and I have this value because it's not what I'm used to, and it makes it perpetually very difficult to break that thought in depressed people. It sounds to me like that identity part is similar with fans of losing teams.
Absolutely. It becomes a part of their fan identity. And when that part goes away, I mean, there's just a void, right? It's sort of like if you loved a team just because of this, or not just because, but in part because of the stadium, and then they build a new stadium. I mean,
Hmm.
you're just going to be like, well, it's just not quite what it was.
Another aspect of your work that I'm really excited to talk about is the coping strategies, the changes in thinking that happen while watching sports and discussing outcomes. I think that a typical sports fan, even a low identifying sports fan, will relate to this idea that fans engage in some forms of bias thinking. In cases where they win, they were responsible. In cases where they lose, the refs are responsible, or anything but the quality of the team. So, how consistent is bias thinking in terms of fans viewing their team's performance compared to their opposing team?
I think this is quite frankly one of the most interesting topics you can discuss because sports fans, if they weren't able to cope, there probably wouldn't be sports fans, right? I've been doing this for a long time, and people will frequently ask me, "What's the weirdest thing about being sports fans?" And they're going to want the stories. I know what they're after about they want to hear the crazy things that fans do. My belief is the craziest thing about sports fans is there actually are sports fans because you know going in that there's like a 50% chance that this product you're going to not be happy after you consume it. You would
Right.
never like order pizza from a delivery service where half the time it comes hot, it's cold, it's late, throw on pizza. But sports fans keep going back, keep going back.
Yeah.
How are they able to do that? Because they've figured out ways to cope. So one of the most common, and I would say are your simplest ways to cope, is by changing your perceptions with respect to the team. There are a number of ways, perceptual biases that sports fans not only do, but I would argue have perfected. For example, they'll change their attributions about their estimates of cause of the team's performance. We did this over the series of a couple of different games where we asked local basketball fans who watched the local team win or lose. We basically said, what do you think was the reason for this outcome? When the local team lost, they externalized everything. The highly identified fans, they externalized everything. The refs were really against us. The other team played over their head. bad luck, just, the ball wasn't bouncing our way. And by doing that, if you say, well, it's not because of us, it's easier to cope with the lack of success. Now, when the local team won, it was because, yeah, our team played great. They have a high level of ability. They put forth the effort. But also in that study, when the team won, the fans were more likely to say, yeah, we were on our game. We were cheering at just the right time. We were the best
Right.
fans ever. So they weren't just internalizing it from the team's perspective, they were internalizing it from their own perspective. We also find that in terms of these cognitive biases, that fans will engage in things like superstitious behavior, right? So, we've talked in here about our need for routine and our need for control. Well, unfortunately for fans, they care a lot about these sporting events with their teams playing in them, but they can't do a lot about them, right? They're not the ones out there swinging the bat, throwing the football, shooting the basketball. So what do? Well, they're like, well, I might not be able to help them on the field, but my gosh, I'll do my part in terms of my superstition. We asked fans, hundreds of them, to list the superstitions they engage in, and we got a wide variety of them. Lucky apparel, lucky rabbit's feet, touched the bill of my hat 3 times. But the one thing that really struck me was we asked them, and these are educated people. We asked them on a scale of 1, no way would it ever, you're being ridiculous, to 8, if you do this superstition, it's guaranteed to help your team succeed. The average was like 5.5 on the scale. So these are people that they're not just, oh, this is silly, but I do it. They literally believe that if they engage in this act, it will help the team succeed. If I wear my lucky hat, my team will win a larger proportion. And when we ask them, why do you do these things? The most common response is, if I don't and they lose, it will be my fault. So again, that's an interesting perceptual bias. Certainly, fans that are diehard fans for teams, they see the future as brighter than it's probably going to be. They see the past. They actually remember the past as better than it actually was. So we've done studies where we're like, how many games did they win like 5 years ago? And interestingly enough, fans with lower levels of identification are more accurate in their recollections, because of highly identified fans, they boost that number to make them feel better about how the past was. No one copes as well as sports fans do.
Right. So the in-group kind of favoritism combined with the out-group derogation, as the official terms go, um, you know, is it inevitable that the higher identification you have with your team, the more you hate their opponents, or is it the case that would I be surprised to learn that there are lots of Steelers fans that don't hate Ravens fans, or is it the case that just typically the more important that team is to you, you almost certainly get to a stage where you have to have a distaste for the rivals?
Yeah, I'm not going to say that there are no fans out there that are diehard fans of a team that don't dislike the team's rivals, but they've got to be a rare species indeed.
Okay.
And I will say this, that if you are a diehard Steelers fan and you're like, you know what, but I'm okay with the Ravens, that all of the other Steelers fans are going to say to you, you're not really a diehard Steelers fan. You can't possibly like both. You can't like North Carolina and Duke. That's not possible. Now, there may actually be that person out there. I don't know. But we know who we love. And to love something, you got to hate something, right? There's light and there's dark. And so when you look at sports fans, again, choosing a team by default means you have chosen not to like this team, right? They come together, favorite teams and disliked teams. I can't say that such a person does not exist, but I can
Sure.
say that other fans of those teams would say, well, you can't really be a fan of the Chicago Bears if you don't hate the Green Bay Packers. That's part of, like you have to know that it's Soldier Field. You have to know who Dick Butkus was. You have to know who Mike Ditkus was, and you have to know who Peyton was, and you have to hate the Green Bay Packers. If you don't like check off all five of those boxes, you can't
Yeah.
really be a diehard Bears fan.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I was asking about this because sometimes when I go to sporting events, I went to a Raiders Dolphins game last year, and they are not a rival at all. But you see both teams represented. This is in Miami. But sometimes I get the sense that, at least for some people who aren't extremely high in identifying with a team, that you shift your perspective from my in group being my team to my in group being all of these football fans in the same place. Have you seen any interesting data that shows that sometimes people fluidly move between these, I guess, concentric circles that might make up their roles?
What you're suggesting is absolutely based on empirical research and theory. It's the common in-group identity model. And what they have found in social psych for a couple of decades now, at least, is that one way to reduce animosity and angst and hostility between rival groups is to give them a common identity amongst the groups. So if you are able to find commonality between group A and group B, then that commonality allows them to feel cohesion among the entire body, right? The consequence of that typically is lower levels of animosity, hostility, violence. And they've actually found this recently among sport fans, where in rivalry situations that have been, plagued with some violent outbursts, that if they remind the people that, okay, yeah, sure, you like this team and you like this team, but we all like the same sport, right? We all have this unifying bond of love for the sport. When they do that, it decreases the level of like hatred and animosity. So it absolutely works. I don't know how much that would play out somewhere in the stands of the Steelers Ravens game. I think that would be kind of tough to come by, but theoretically and empirically, that absolutely is the truth.
Talk a little bit more about sports fan aggression, because I get the impression that it's been on the rise. I don't know the trends, but obviously you've looked into this area of spectator aggression. What do we need to know about the patterns of spectator aggression?
Well, one thing I'll say is that we are not really able to compare data from one time frame to another.
Mhm.
So think about the person who sits, out in the bleachers at Yankee Stadium and yells profanities at the opposing team's right fielder. No one's keeping track of that. That's an act of aggression. That's verbal aggression, right? But no one is like with a clicker standing out there. So a lot of these things, we just don't have the data to compare one generation to another. Having said that, you sure can look at theory and other data points that would suggest that the incidence of fan aggression, whether it's verbal or physical or whatever, that it's on the rise. We are less civil of a society than we were 25, 50, 75 years ago. Civility, they track this stuff, it goes down. Empathy has gone down. So if as a society we're less civil, why would we expect the ballpark to be any different, right? And if you watch videos of fans like back in the 1940s, I mean, I won't say that they look boring, but it is so interesting to watch how they're all dressed up in dresses and suits and ties, and they're just sitting there. And when something good happens, they stand up and then they sit back down. It's taken us a while to get to the point now where it's like you sort of take your life in your own hands when you go into some stadiums. I think the hint is the fact that now most stadiums will have family sections. They have now figured out that they have to have a special section where they can kind of quarantine the people away from the more rowdy fans. That's probably a sign that things are a little bit different now. I wish I could give you numbers, but those
I mean,
numbers aren't really
I would just like to have a beer in a glass bottle, to be frank. It's anything but the plastic bottles.
exactly. Yeah. And then what do they go and do? They make a bad call in a football game this last fall, and the fans throw like billions of bottles onto the field while they're looking at the replay. And they come back and they overturn the call. And then every game after, I was watching that game with my wife, and I said, Michelle, you know that from here on out, that all the fans are going to start throwing bottles because they think it worked. Sure enough, a whole year plagued by bottle throwing. Yeah, I know. It's never a dull moment.
Yeah. As we wrap up, could you put into context the recent, let's say in the last 10 years, changes in how fans interact with their sport? Obviously, social media has increased. You can follow specific players on social media, which of course really drives up that identification. If I would imagine if you identify closely with a player, you're more likely to participate in team activities, buy a jersey, and so on and so forth. I'm a big fantasy sports player, and I feel like that's consistently grown over the last couple decades, and even that kind of draws you in even more. But in your perspective, if you look at all of the changes that have happened recently in how you interact with a team, what are the ones that are worth noting for you?
Uh, I'll start with the increased availability to legally wager on sporting events. That, forever, the major sports and NCAA, they're very much against, loosening up the ability for people to wager because they thought that it was going to change how fans consume sport. That they're no longer going to root for a team, they're just going to root for whoever they bet on. And then at some point they realize, well, yeah, but they're still rooting. And so here's another way we can get them attached. And so now the NFL was like, no, no, no. Now the NFL has like NFL Red Zone. The whole point of NFL Red Zone is for people that are playing fantasy sports and also wagering on these things. So I think that, this is such a new uh, component to being a sport fan. And fans have been gambling lots of money under the table forever, but now they can do it above board.
Mhm.
And it's going to be interesting to see in 10 years from now, has it changed the projection of sport? Has it increased the number of fans that show interest? Has it decreased it? Has it not changed anything in that way? I think that that's one thing that we're certainly keeping an eye on. Safety concerns for both players and the fans themselves. It's going to change how sport is played. And if you change how sport's played, it's going to change how sport is consumed. I mean, I don't know why the NFL just doesn't say, okay, from now on, take the ball out on the 25, right? I mean, they're eliminating the kickoff because there was so much damage that was being done during kickoffs that at some point there's okay, we'll just do here. And then you got the fans that are old school fans, and they're like, I want to see people getting knocked into tomorrow,
Mhm.
and so because
Right.
of concerns for safety, it's going to change the product, which will change what it means to people, and concern for fan safety used to be that whenever we got tickets to baseball games, major or minor league, our desire was to sit front row somewhere like near the dugout. And we would bring our gloves, and you're going to catch foul balls. They have nets now, right? And they've got these
Mhm.
mandated nets that go foul pole to foul pole because the sports fans in the front row, they're not looking here, they're looking down their phone, and they're getting drilled every time they turned around. Well, that changes the experience, right? It used to be I'll get a front row, nothing between me and the grass, nothing between me and the. Well, now it's nothing between. Oh wait, now I got the big giant,
Yeah.
netting in front of me. That's understandable, right? The safety is important, but again, that's going to change how people consume. And then last, I would add technology. That when you look at things like virtual reality, they're not that far away from having somebody in Central Florida put on a virtual reality gear and fire up the live Pittsburgh Steelers game, and it will make them feel as though they are at the stadium. I think that's going to potentially change how people consume sport as well.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for chatting about this. If anything, I think I feel more content in my fandom. I feel like I don't have any more guilt about the benefits that I know I get from sports. I don't know if my fiance is going to be happy to hear that I'm doubling down on my sports fandom, but I think I convinced her to. I think she's starting to come around to at least in the fantasy realm. but thank you so much for being on today. I really appreciate it, Daniel Wann.
My pleasure. Thank you.
For more on Dan, visit his faculty page at www.murraystate.edu or purchase a copy of the third edition of Sports Fans, The Psychology and Social Impact of Fandom, wherever books are sold. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with 2 of your friends. Head over to patreon.com/whydowedo-that-podcast to become a paid supporter of the show. You'll gain early access to episodes as well as bonus video content. Follow on Instagram or Facebook at Why Do We Do That Podcast or on X at WDWDTpod. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?